Welcome to another episode of Go Beyond. We are really excited to have you with us today. This week, we have been exploring the book of Esther. And just as a reminder to you, of course, my name is Alyssa Robinson. I'm the digital strategist at Treach. And the purpose of Go Beyond is for us to be able to dig deeper into the message that is shared with us on Sunday, whether it be from Pastor Daniel, Pastor Doug, from Karen, whoever it is that's bringing the message on Sunday morning. We want to take some time on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to dig deeper into that message. And so Mondays are always about the context of the story, more about taking a historical look at the book of the Bible that we're digging around in. Wednesdays are my favorite days where I get to challenge Daniel and ask more personal questions. And then Fridays, we focus on a spiritual practice. So I'm really happy that you're here with me and Pastor Daniel today. And let's go ahead and get started challenging the book of Esther. Daniel, are you ready?
I think I'm ready. I'm always in great trepidation on Wednesdays, but here we go.
So on Monday, I ended our live stream by claiming that I am Team Vashti. Vashti. I always say it wrong. What is it?
All right. Vashti.
Vashti. I am Team Vashti. She was the character. She had a very short showing at the very beginning of scripture, but she was the character that I personally related to most because the king was like, hey, come out and dance for us. She was like, no, I won't. And the rest is history. But what I want to know, we really don't know anything about her, but it's that one act of Vashti that I'm going to get that name wrong every time,
You got it
that
right.
catapults the rest of the story. The story would not exist if it wasn't for her one action of refusing the king. So I
That's
want
right.
to know some of your thoughts around that. Why do you think she refused to display her beauty for the king? Why was that an important part of this story?
Well, so obviously I can only give you my perspective, but again, a story that tells us about faith. And so that story has to have the great characterizations that it does. And so two strong women, Vashti and Esther. Vashti has to set it up. And it's curious, by the way, some of the commentators believe that what they vary. Some believe that what the king was asking of her was literally to dance naked with her crown on. Others thought that it was that she was to come out in her full regalia with the crown on and sort of demonstrate her own sort of power. Either way, she basically says no, right? And either way, she says, I'm not going to be looked at by my looks or whatever. I'm going to stand my ground. And so she really is a strong character, and she really does set the tone for what needs to come ahead, which is Esther. But I guess, like many characters, she has to fall by the wayside because Esther's going to take the front and center. Esther's going to be the heroine of the story, and so I just make up that Vashti had to be that strong character and stand her ground in order for the rest of the story to take shape. And sometimes that's what happens in the real world too, right? Is that people take a stand and they set the course, but then they kind of go on their way, if you will, or they kind of fall out in terms of how the rest of the story plays out. But she is a vital character. I mean, as you rightfully point out, the rest of the book can't take shape unless Vashti does what she does.
Well,
I think she's a very strong character.
yeah, I definitely want to learn more about her. And you had mentioned on Monday that there is more about Vashti in the
Hmm.
Apocrypha. So
Yeah.
if you're interested in more about her, I am convinced that if I was catapulted back in time, I would be one of the first women killed, I'm sure. I'm very
Well,
convinced of that.
yeah. I mean, I don't want to discount what you're saying because we all can conjecture what we would do, 2 and 3 and 4,000 years ago, given our upbringing now, right, and giving our cultural mores now, and yet um, we literally can't quite determine how it is. Have you got me? I think I got lost, huh?
Yeah, I think that I lost you for a second. It seemed to glitch a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to our next question. Um, so even though, and I also brought this up on Monday, even though the book is called Esther, we don't actually get to hear from her much until the moment where she needs to step in front of the king, and ask about, or ask for him to take mercy on her people and not to attack her people. But before that, I'm just curious, because with as great of a story as this is and how well written it is, it's very fact based, and we're not getting as much about, when we would read a novel, understanding what the character is thinking and feeling and experiencing, because we're busy getting all of the facts of the story in place because there's so many to put together. It's a puzzle. But what do you think could be going through her mind each step of this story?
Well, I think, again, first of all, go read the editions of Esther out of the Apocrypha, because some of that actually is there, what you're talking about. But secondly, I think all I can do is conjecture, right? But I think Esther is both scared to death about what lies ahead. I think it's underplayed in the reporting of the model we have in the Hebrew text of how important it is that she's a Jew, and she can't quite express that. I think in modern day time, we underestimate how important that was. So for her to sort of step out ultimately, as she does, and acknowledge that she's Jewish is huge. For her not to have acknowledged that initially is huge and a part of the culture. And then for her to sort of finally step up into that becomes a critical step forward. And why, as I said on Monday, that I believe, even though God's name is never mentioned or God's never sort of identified, that God sort of is pervasive in the whole story. And I think that's a part of that. I think she's scared to death, but she takes great courage. And I think courage is that sort of context of, I don't know how I'm going to do this because I really am afraid, but I choose to move forward in the midst of my fear. That's what courage is. And so I think she's both scared to death and deeply courageous, and steps up on behalf of a whole people because of that. And I think there's all kinds of thoughts going through her head. Should I do this? Can I do this? Will I do this? Who's going to suffer in this? Am I going to suffer, or are my people going to suffer? Will there be unintended consequences for my people or for my family, right? I don't doubt for a second all of that is going through her head, and why, therefore, again, it's so important that she does what she does, and why we can't underestimate it, because all of that stuff, just like for each one of us, is resonating under the surface about, should we speak into this? Should we do something about this? Is there something else we could do instead of standing up for our people? I think all of that's going through her head, and unfortunately, it's not written about. But if we reflect on it, I think we could, every last one of us, and certainly any woman, could put themselves in her place and recognize the courageous strength that it took for her to do what she did.
Well, as the story unfolds, spoiler alerts, everybody. So Esther does convince the king to lay off the Jews. And and Haman, who was the person conspiring against them and conspiring against Esther's uncle Mordecai, is actually put to death, and Mordecai is put into a position with power, and Esther is the reigning queen. But it bothers me at the end of the story, because after all of this has happened and all of this, beautiful triumph of the pure of heart went out, the Jewish people go on a killing spree, and they are killing anybody who disagrees with them. And they're, and people are so afraid that they're saying, no, I'm Jewish, so that they won't get killed. And so I'm just wondering, why couldn't they have just stopped at being saved? Like, why all of the violence? And I feel like I ask this question for every Old Testament story, because I just feel like it is not God's heart that they went out and did that. So it feels like they become the villains in the end, because they're the ones going out and killing huge groups of people.
Yeah, but according to their own testimony, at least they didn't take the plunder.
Oh, okay.
I'm teasing, of course, but I mean, it is laughable that on two different occasions, as it describes in the text, that I forget the numbers anymore, but 500 and then 2,000 and then 75,000 or whatever, that on the last two occasions they said, but we didn't take any of the plunder. We killed all these people. We didn't take any of their plunder, right? As if somehow that were good news, right? But you speak the absolute truth with regard to what I call and many call the human condition. And that is, every last one of us has this thing within us that obviously varies by individual, but we've all got a sense of it in ourselves that, by golly, if I've conquered you and I've overcome you and I now have the power, I now have the authority, I'm going to stomp on you or put you down or whatever. And we can't really justify it. But for some of us, it's just in our heart and what we think in our heads. But for others of us, it's, I'm going to take this sword or I'm going to take this gun or whatever. And we actually do the evil thing. I think the story is just that real. I think it owns the human condition, that even the chosen people of God are no better than anybody else, right? I mean, it clearly states that. They go on a horribly vindictive rant that kills thousands of people, all quote unquote in the name of God. And we look back on that and go, golly, I mean, you're voicing what everybody who reads the story thinks at a minimum, and certainly voices as you have. Why does it have to be this way? And the short, simple answer is it doesn't have to be that way. And yet it is a part of our human condition that we want power and we want authority. And sometimes we take that way too far and we do the very thing that has been done to us, or in this case was intended to be done to us. And there is no justification for it. I mean, literally, pure and simple, there's no justification for it. I suppose if there's any good news in all of this, it highlights the fact that no one of us, not Jews, not Christians, not anybody else, is any better than any other human being. We just have different ways of expressing our connection with our God and different ways of understanding how we ought to live that out. And, we Christians have been guilty of the same thing over the centuries, right? And it's not something we are proud of, at least I hope we're not. And yet it's a part of our human reality and our human frailty that we do those kinds of things. And do I wish it weren't so? Absolutely. I wish it weren't so. But it is so. And it's been known for centuries now that when we are oppressed, and if we come out from under that oppression, we often retaliate. And it's a shameful part of our humanity. And I think that's all the story is pointing out in a very realistic way, that here's who we are as people. It's weird stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and we had a question on Facebook that was actually directed to me, but I'm going to have both of us answer it. It said, Alyssa, who do you see as the Esthers today? And that's a really good question. And my first thought, I'm having trouble. So the specific person that I thought of is actually the pastor of the church that I attend at Oaklawn, is Pastor Rachel Bachman. Because when I think of who an Esther is today, and I'm not necessarily saying it has to be a woman, but I think of someone who persistently and strategically speaks truth to power. Over and over and over again, fighting for the oppressed. And she was the first person who came to mind for me. But I think it could be anyone who, and I think that the defining factor for me is someone who is willing to speak truth to power in a way that is peaceful and led with understanding. Because when I think of Esther, she had a complete understanding of the situation, and she didn't just come out of the gate to the king and be like, hey, I need your help with this. She provided 3 feasts for him, and, to kind of, I say to butter him up, but you could say it's a political move for her to be able to peacefully make a connection of understanding between the two of them before she makes any request. And so I'm sure we all have somebody in our life that we've seen as an Esther who has that wisdom and the understanding of good timing.
Yeah. No, I would agree. And I'll just name a few, because I think it's hard to name an Esther without realizing it ought to be a woman, but it does, as you point out, it doesn't have to be. But so Jen Hatmaker is one of those for me, who is an author and a pastor and a blogger who speaks truth to power on a regular basis, primarily in the religious realm. One who's recently passed away within the last 18 months or so is Rachel Held Evans, who spoke power to truth to power. And then interestingly, and I felt this way for a long time, but Kay and I, my wife, just watched a special on Michelle Obama on her book tour about becoming. And I see her as an Esther, and she's speaking into the truths of African-American women in particular, and her own upbringing and becoming. And she does it very peacefully and yet tremendously courageously about the circumstances under which we find ourselves in our country and the ways in which we need to speak truth into that power. And then finally, and just one guy in all of this, I would lift up Shane Claiborne, who is a part of the Simple Way. Shane's a phenomenal witness for the gospel, a powerful prophetic witness, and speaks truth to power every single day with regard to several of the injustices that we face in this world. So those are who I would identify.
Well, and for you personally, has there been a time in your ministry that was a big moment for you where you made the decision to speak truth to power and stand up for something that maybe wasn't the popular opinion at the time?
Yeah, well, so I hope this isn't flippant, but you're asking someone who has more power than he ought to have because of his privilege to answer that question. As a white heterosexual male, I have more privilege than anybody is due. And that privilege has so much power to it. It's almost shameful. I'm upset today, and I apologize. I've already had a couple of encounters today with regard to the death of George Floyd. And it troubles me that there are far too many of me in the world who have more power and authority than they realize, and they use it in shameful ways. And the death of George Floyd is an example of that. And unfortunately, it's one among a myriad of examples, even recently and clearly over the last decades, that we need to speak out against and acknowledge that we've got this atrocious sin in our country of racism that is so blatant and yet so subliminal that we tend to assume that it's no longer with us or among us or a part of us. And it's clear that it is. I just saw, for instance, some pictures on social media that sort of put on one side the Anglo men who were protesting in Michigan, literally spitting at and in the face of yelling at white officers, and those white officers just standing there taking it. Counter that with the picture from last night in Minneapolis, where activists, or people really, not even activists, are protesting the death of George Floyd, and they're getting tear bombed and blasted out, and both are doing legal things, but the responses are radically different because, in my opinion, some of those protesters are white and they're being respected, and some of those protesters in a different circumstance are African American and they're being blasted with tear gas. And I say all of that not having nothing to do with police officers, but having everything to do with the intrinsic power that certain people hold that they abuse. And so I think we've got to call this out in our society, and we've got to we've got to identify how wrong it is, but we can't identify how wrong it is until some of us who have that power speak it out ourselves and own that the privileges that we have nothing to do with everything's been handed to you, but rather that you've been offered opportunities to get ahead that others haven't. And sometimes we don't even know it. And so until and unless we can own that, I don't think that particular circumstance is going to change. Now, that's deeply personal to me because of my family. But it ought to be deeply personal because it's real. And I think that's where some of the internal shame comes from, is a real sense that this is wrong just because it's wrong, right? And so I think that's a very current reality for me. Speaking truth to power is always difficult. And I believe I've done that more often than not through my preaching and through how I speak into that in Sunday in and Sunday out with regard to messages. And to realize that anytime I get pushback on speaking truth into power, it says to me, well, by golly, you've probably hit a nerve, and there may be power in that circumstance that you didn't even realize, and yet the pushback indicates that there's some dilemma there. So anyway, that's the answer you get today.
Well, and I think it's interesting, the thought that to speak truth to power, first you have to recognize, am I the one with the power?
Right.
Am I the one who could potentially, whether meant or not, be the oppressor because I'm feeding into a system that is violating the rights of individuals based on the color of their skin or based on their sexual orientation or their gender or whatever it is. Speaking truth to power could start with speaking truth to yourself.
Right.
And recognizing my role.
Right. I think that's critical, right? Is again, for those of us who have privilege, and you have privilege just like I do, I have more privilege than I should, but we can't get anywhere unless we own that privilege, understand that it's real, and then figure out a way to use that privilege to help those that don't have privilege somehow, some way. And that's all I mean by this. And I have remained relatively quiet on racial tension issues over the years because I've chosen over the years to try to work at it through relationship personally, relationships that I develop, relationships that I foster, relationships that I believe will help one person and one relationship at a time. And I will continue to do that. But I also feel now that, golly, it obviously must take more than that because it's not getting better. I believe there was a time in our country when it was getting better, racial tension and racial strife and the racial inequities, that we have made progress. But golly, over the last 5 years or so, we have taken a huge step backwards. And that should not be so. There's no reason for it, other than the fact that it's been allowed to re-enter the normality of our society. And we can't continue to accept that because it's not right. Jesus would not accept that. God does not accept that. And we have got to do more to help out with these inequalities among the races, the sexes, the genders. We've got to figure out ways to help bring greater equity and justice into this system.
Well, and all of this so directly relates to the book of Esther and
it does.
Fighting for her people and the rights of her people. And so I think that that's all that we have time for today. But Amazing response and good conversation. I really appreciate you opening up your personal life to us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for today. It's always fun.
So I hope that everybody will join us on Friday. We are going to talk about the spiritual practice of fasting. And this is directly related to the book of Esther as well. And so join us at 12:30 on Friday for another episode of Go Beyond. And remember, you can catch all previous episodes at tmumc.org/go beyond. So we'll see you on Friday.